Hello and welcome to Daytime, your place for scary stories, straight from the horror forums of Reddit. Make sure to like and subscribe for more horror tales of things that go bumping the night. On tonight's episode, a man gets a special job for an agency of supernatural hunters. So, where have you worked? Because I worked for the Department of Unknown Crises.
Let's consider some hypotheticals. Let's say you got yourself a master's degree. Let's say that got you a job at a small branch of state government. Let's say you worked there for the better part of your early adult life. You built everything around that job. Got an apartment, moved in with your girlfriend, had an orange cat with, seemingly, a single brain cell. Life is good, right? Hypothetical. Then along comes this man. Says he works in conjunction with the federal government and the private sector. The guy reeks corporate, got a suit with a custom cut, no labels on his clothes. Tells us that we're going to be working closely with a small department that has recently got a boost. Apparently, there's a need for expansion, and some people from my branch will be moving on up. Let's say that one of those people is me. Hypothetically. All right, I'm going to stop that. Sorry, it gets to me. You can safely presume that I've changed a couple of details to make myself less recognizable. I got to get through the filters. I had to move from Milwaukee up to Superior. Sarah and I tried to make it work, but she couldn't leave the city behind. It came down to the choice between me and the rest of her life. It made sense for her to stay. Kind of pissed that she kept the cat, though. That thing loved me. I started working at the DUC in September of 1998. At first, I didn't even know what the acronym stood for. It wasn't a matter of secrecy, but they had these stupid sayings plastered along the walls that people followed to a T. For example, water of a duke's back. This was the standard operating procedure. Don't ask too many questions. Let your questions and worries drift right off, like water off a duck's back. They displayed this proudly in the lunchroom with a picture of a duck peacefully sleeping by a pond. We worked in collaboration with other agencies in Michigan, Iowa, and Minnesota. Mostly Minnesota. I helped them develop software to codify reports of invasive ecological species. It would break down verbal reports with a bare-bones text-to-speech system, which in turn is transcribed and separated into categories. Categories were measured, analyzed, and turned into probability reports. Once information had been categorized, the most prominent reports would be sent to the department lead. Seems simple by today's standards, but back then it was cutting-edge stuff. It was November 1999 when we finalized the first version of our system, lovingly named Daisy. Hours before the launch party, the department lead took me to his office, closed the blinds, and sat quietly across from me for about 2 solid minutes. This man, the department lead, was Thomas Rubin, a 67-year-old ex-drill sergeant with a penchant for the dramatic. Kept his head as bald as his lies. Having worked there for over a year, I thought I had a foot in the door by then. Turns out I was still on the outside, and until that very moment. Thomas poured me a shot. Mint schnapps.
To a job well done,
He said, raising his glass. I accepted the invitation and downed the shot. What the hell, right?
Do you have recurring nightmares, Saturdead?
He asked.
Seeing something strange at night? Those last few hours before the sunrise, do the shadows gain a peculiar tint?
No, sir.
You're not a very haunted man, are you?
I am not, sir.
I can work with that.
He poured me another drink.
I can get you working on the real deal,
He said.
but you're not going to like it. You're not going to like it one bit. That sound like a party to you?
I took the glass and studied it. Little sugar crystals swirling around, backlit from a lone computer screen. I downed the second shot, and Thomas smiled.
Imagine a lighthouse, he said. And whenever someone thinks about the lighthouse, it lights up. You with me so far?
Yes, sir.
And this lighthouse draws in all kinds of things from far and wide. Traders, smugglers, warships, everything. But you don't want that. The beach is closed and these ships are bad news. What do?
We turn off the lighthouse, sir.
Ah, but it comes right back on whenever someone thinks about it, even when you do it.
We Demolish the lighthouse, sir.
Same thing, pops right back once you think about it. Try again.
We forget about it, sir.
You can't unknow something.
Then you'd have to go after the people that know about it. And you'd have to be careful not to learn anything about it yourself.
And that's what we do,
Said Thomas.
we turn off the lighthouses.
Thomas elaborated over the course of 3 more shots. What he was describing was an invasive ecological agent, something that literally grew from the ground. Its very presence acts as a sort of go-ahead for other, more dangerous entities. But thinking about it too much causes it to appear. Not immediately, but slowly over time. The more you knew and the more intimate your knowledge about it was, the stronger the connection would be. I was safe, though. You had to know the details to trigger it. Thomas gave me the example of a red lily. You couldn't just know it was red or a lily. You had to know both these things to imagine it clearly. Once you did, there's a chance it starts appearing more and more in your everyday life, until it takes physical form. And by then, you've opened an express highway to something far darker and far worse. The DUC, or the Department for Unknown Crises, was founded to combat these entities in a way that doesn't endanger the general populace. We were preventative, mostly. The software we made scrubbed away all details and simply stated an address, sometimes a person, and the likelihood of there being at least one physical manifestation of the invasive species present. As the system was automated, there was no way for us to know the details. Only the computer knew. According to Thomas, there was a time when these things had been completely eradicated. Right before the start of the Second World War, there had been a concentrated effort to remove them. The methods they used was later adapted in creation of the DUC. Turns out those things can't ever be truly removed. There was an author who documented these ecological entities to such a degree that it could be used as a gateway. While he passed away in 1926, possibly as part of the containment, his diaries were discovered in the 60s. Since then, the invasive species had free rein with no one to stop them. There had been some loose efforts, mostly from the private sector, but it took the creation of the DUC to start the work on a larger scale. And there we were. From that point forward, I started to work with more specific field equipment. Since being able to imagine the object is something that triggers it to manifest, we needed a way for field agents to physically remove them without putting themselves in danger. We came up with something we called the Blur Guard, a full headset that removes all color, dampens sound, and mildly blurs your vision. Going back to the example of a red lily, the Blur Guard turned it from a red lily to some kind of flower. That's not enough detail to trigger a manifestation, and thus deemed safe. Since our software knew what to look for, we incorporated a camera and basic image recognition. There'd be a little green light showing up whenever what we were looking for was in view. From that point on, our field agents could play hot or cold until they found what they were supposed to remove. And when it came to people, well, we can't kill them or have them unlearn something. So instead, there was a targeted effort to herd them into place, where we knew this problem was prominent enough to go unnoticed. The DUC had done it for decades. These were personalized, targeted efforts. Maybe sending a particularly juicy job offer, enticing a target to move, things like that. We focused on 2 main sites, a rural town in Minnesota and one in West Virginia. There were talks of one up in New England, but that was a separate department. These places have been absolutely scrubbed. To this day, you can't even find them on a map. Our colleagues in the private sector bought out pretty much everything there is to own, giving the DUC close to full control. It might seem cruel, but most of these people had no idea that they'd been manipulated. They lived good lives. We did our best to turn off as many lighthouses as we could, but in a town like that, some were bound to pop up eventually. Let's skip ahead a couple of years. In the summer of 2004, I had been on rotation assisting with the development of new equipment. I was also regularly updating both Daisy and the Blur Guard. We had implemented generalized search filters, looking for the trigger words that Daisy could use, increasing our information input tenfold. Hell, about 90% of forum infrastructure could be breached to censor descriptions of the invasive agents if needed. We had basic bots prowling most major discussion forums to contain eventual spread. One night, I'd taken my work home with me to work on a camera light. Some field agents had mentioned image recognition issues in low-light areas where the camera refused to work, so I figured an extra light source would go a long way. I was blasting my work time playlist on my laptop, sipping on my second rum and coke. If I was going to do extra work from home, I might as well make an event out of it. Just short of midnight, it was time to try it out. I turned off the lights, put on the helmet, and checked to see if the camera light auto-activated as instructed. It did. Strange thing, though. I was getting a green marker. The helmet was recognizing the invasive element right in front of me. I know my own apartment top to bottom, so I know exactly what I was looking at, blurred helmet or no. I'm obviously not going to describe it to you, but it had the appearance of a household plant, quite large. I'd had it in my window for years. For the sake of storytelling, let's call it a red lily, like in Thomas's example. Suddenly it dawned on me. Now I knew what the invasive agent was. I couldn't unlearn it. From that point forward, I was going to be a threat to the department. This was an invitation for red lilies to pop up out of nowhere, possibly making everyone aware of them. But first and foremost, they'd be a lighthouse for other things to come. I pulled the lily out of the pot, roots and all, and shoved it down the garbage disposal. I swear, the damn thing screamed. The empty pot was left on the windowsill. Moments later, my phone rang. Turns out my blur guard was actively connected to the DAISY system. It had probably sent out a report to the department lead with my name and address the moment it recognized the species. I held my breath, trying to calm down. This was going to spark a series of events. There'd be a report, an investigation. I'd most likely lose my job and be forced to relocate. No, worse. This was unprecedented. As expected, the call came from Thomas.
What's going on?
He asked. I'm working on the internal camera light. I think there's a malfunction.
We got a positive match on your location.
I know. It's not a big deal. It's nothing,
We're going to stick to protocol on this one,
said Thomas.
Expect 3 field agents on site within 15 minutes. Don't go anywhere.
I pulled my hair. My hand wouldn't stop shaking. I usually get the shakes when I'm losing control. I figured I'd better remove all traces of the plant, whatever parts were stuck in the garbage disposal, and whatever remained in the pot. Except when I looked back up, there was another red lily growing from the pot, almost exactly the same, like it had never left. I can't stress this enough. You can't unlearn things. You can't unremember something. I tried not to think about it, but that just made me think of it more. I fetched a Rubik's Cube from my desk to focus on something else, but as soon as that color showed up, my mind sank back to thinking of it. I got a garbage bag and threw the whole pot in along with the rest of the garbage. There'd be nothing left. I went room by room, looking for anything remotely resembling it, but there was nothing. So I left the apartment, intent on throwing it all away. But see, there's this communal garden project outside my apartment building that was filled with these things. There were dozens of red lilies. My mind blanked, and I could feel my pulse rising in my throat. This entire neighborhood could be compromised. Possibly more. I couldn't for the life of me remember if the lilies had been there earlier that day, or if it was a reaction to my realization. These things were insidious. They not only appear when you think about them, but they make a conscious effort to pop up when they are least expected, or wanted. I called my landlord, Jerry, and started pulling up lilies from the community garden with my free hand. Some of them screamed. It was like a tiny wail from a baby. Some of the lilies clung to the dirt, digging their roots deeper. Others came willingly. One of them withered in my hand, giving up completely. When Jerry finally picked up, I was out of breath. I need to ask about the communal garden project, I said. I work with the Department of Fish and Wildlife. There's a bit of an invasive species growing here, and I need to establish a time frame as to when they appeared.
All right.
The red lilies, the community garden lilies, they're actually a dangerous and invasive species. Do you have any idea how long they've been here?
Red lilies? Oh, yeah. We've had those for a while.
How long? There was a silence on the other end. Maybe he was thinking about it. I didn't have that kind of time. How long, Jerry?
Look, I don't know. 8, maybe 9 years?
I grabbed my hair and pulled. The pain in my scalp forced me to concentrate. A handful of hairs gave way. Thanks, Jerry. If you see these, throw them away. Immediately.
I'll do that.
And don't tell anyone. We don't want to alarm people. I hung up. I was flailing, breaking protocol left and right. I was a breach waiting to be sealed. I was on my knees in the dirt, pulling up red lilies by the handful. One of my neighbors walked past, and I could hear her dog whining at the sight of me. Or maybe it saw something I didn't. There was no telling what this would mean. Most breaches we'd encountered was 1 or 2 of these things. At most, they were usually contained to the Minnesota side of the operation. Them having skipped the state line and latching onto me was alarming. This could prompt a whole new level of response. I knew Thomas had a level black response where termination of lives would be necessary to contain the threat, but we'd never employed it. Not yet. But looking around me and running the numbers, this might be it. This could be the first time they'd have to kill people, and I'd be the first in line. The field agents would be there at any moment. My hands were red and raw from pulling up lilies and stuffing them into the garbage bag. I was so frantic that I grabbed everything that even remotely resembled them. Anything red, anything lily-shaped. I tore up more than half the community garden in 10 minutes flat. I could hear a car coming. Couldn't take any chances. I looked over the garden again, couldn't see any of them, and sprinted to the garbage cans. The moment I had thrown it all away, I saw headlights turning the corner. I recognized them. I brushed my hands off the best I could and shoved them in my pockets. A white hatchback with government license plates pulled up, and 3 people got out. I tried to stay calm. I tried not to think about red lilies. I tried to smile. I could tell that I was looking at Agent Estevez, Young, and Owens. I'd worked with these people plenty of times to prep them for excursion. Never to this extent, though, and never on this side of the states. They all fixed and activated their blur guard helmets.
Rough night?
Asked Estevez. Yeah, I nodded. Working on an update. The helmet kind of,
Sure. We'll just check out the apartment and be on our way. You mind waiting down here?
No, that's fine. They turned on their image recog, synced their comms, and gave me a pat on the shoulder.
We'll be in and out,
Said Young.
Sorry about the trouble.
I watched them ascend the stairway while I stayed out by the garden. I was going to make sure nothing popped up. If the agents just up and left, I could come up with a plan. I'd tell Thomas eventually, but I had to be clever about it. I had to assess the damage and spread to make sure I could trigger a quarantine rather than an eradication-level response. Still, looking around the apartment complex, there were probably hundreds of people living there. These things could have made their way into every single household, opening the way for pretty much anything. Not that I had the slightest idea of what that might be. I was lost in thought for the better part of half an hour. What the hell was taking them so long? Had they found one? I walked up the stairway and put my hand on the apartment door. It was quiet. It shouldn't be quiet. I got this sinking feeling, like my body heat was leaking out of my feet. My mind started to race with possibilities. Maybe they left, went to the wrong apartment. Maybe they were watching TV on my couch, having a beer, burning a red lily in the tub. Whatever they did, they wouldn't do it quietly. And this was quiet. I pushed the door open and was met with a chemical smell, like a moist mix of methanol and iron. It was strong enough to taste. Estevez? I coughed out. You guys okay in there? No response. I stepped back out, gasping for fresh air. The smell burned my nose hairs. My eyes teared up as I tried not to sneeze. I didn't want to go back in. I knew it was bad. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. Still, I didn't have a choice. I stepped back in and shut the door behind me. I turned on the lights. They'd been torn to pieces. There was blood dripping from the ceiling. 2 severed arms on the kitchen table. An armless, legless torso resting on the couch. The blood sinking into the cracks in the leather. The floor was covered in gore, torn straight from their bodies and left in the open. Muscle, sinew, vital organs, all splayed out on the floor and furniture. There was a single red lily in a brand new pot, resting on the windowsill. There was a bright red handprint on the bathroom door. I gently pushed the door open, only to reveal the severed heads of Estevez, Young, and Owens. unceremoniously thrown into a pile on the floor of my shower cabinet. I don't know how long I stood there. My mind went completely blank. I could honestly not tell if it was real or a nightmare. For a moment, I was awash with this intense relief. It had to be a nightmare. It didn't make sense for something so terrible to happen so suddenly. It took me a while to realize that there was something looking at me from the bathroom mirror. I turned to it. My face wasn't there, just a dark space where my face ought to be. It was like staring into a hole, vaguely shaped like a humanoid. It followed my movements as I leaned my head left and right. We looked at one another in silence, hearing only the blood dripping from the living room ceiling. A trembling whisper burrowed into my spine. Hello. This was one of the things Thomas had warned us about. This was one of the ships that came to shore following the lighthouse. One of the countless entities invited into my world. Drawn in by this thing. That thing that ought not to be. I hate calling it a red lily. I want to scream what it is and have them torn apart, but I can't describe them, or they'll spread out of control. The longer I stared at the thing in the mirror, the more I understood. It was one thing to know about the red lilies. It was 100 times more potent to know exactly how they worked. For an average person to know their appearance might invite a few to pop up, but to know them at the level that I did, that was an entirely different league. To these things, I was precious cargo. I could light 100 lighthouses, 1,000. They perceived Estevez and the other agents as a threat and disposed of them immediately. I was the equivalent of a carrier. Patient zero. I was stuck in the eye of the storm, and everything around me would be torn to shreds. I ran 100 scenarios in my mind. Destroying myself was the obvious choice, but that would be the nail in the coffin that would force Thomas to take violent action on this entire apartment complex. Without context, he wouldn't know how to contain it. Losing personnel was the final criteria for a black level response. However, if it was attributed to a breach of protocol or faulty equipment, I could bring it down to a quarantine. There was hope, but I had to explain it. I had to stay alive. As I pondered my options, I heard a running motor outside. I stepped out of the bathroom and out onto the walkway. Another 2 white hatchbacks had pulled up. I'd lost track of time. No one in Estevez's team had reported an all clear or anything. This had prompted a standard backup response. If these teams found traces of anything, our entire field division would be called in. They'd probably put people all the way down in Des Moines on high alert within the next 15 minutes if there was no de-escalation. There were already new red lilies growing in the community garden. They wouldn't let me talk. Talking was a hazard, since I could verbally describe what they were looking for. I could yell out, "They look like red lilies," and the entire squad would be compromised. Up until this point, we'd never had to worry about that kind of willful exposure, and there was no plan for it. The DUC didn't have enemies in the active sense. We were preventative. There was no way they'd let me talk or leave. Not with 3 human remains in my apartment. At best, they'd gag me and burn this place to the ground. At worst, they'd shoot me and then do the same. I scurried along the walkway, turning left at the far end. I took the fire escape to the ground floor, hugged the wall of the building, and circled back to the parking lot. I burst into a sprint for my sedan. Luckily, no one noticed. At least no one that cared. As soon as I got on the highway, I called Thomas. I had trouble staying in my lane. My hands kept cramping up. Thomas picked up. I could hear him opening a door, putting on a jacket.
You gotta tell me what's going on,
He said,
Where are you?
I had to go. I had to. The place is infested.
So, let's deal with it.
I didn't know what to say. There was no good place to start. I leaned back in my seat, tried to keep the car straight, and took a deep breath. There were flashes of red by the roadside. Could have been red lilies. The back seat was dark enough to hide a possible shape. I thought I saw an outline in the rearview mirror, but it might have been my mind playing tricks.
Stay where you are. I'll have someone pick you up and we'll deal with it.
I can't, I said. It's bad, Thomas. It's real bad.
How bad are we talking?
We're talking, quarantine. Breach of protocol. At least 3 casualties. Thomas took a deep breath. He held the line for a few seconds. I could hear him get into a car.
You know, don't you?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
they're everywhere. I can't stop seeing them.
Don't tell me anything. Nothing. I shouldn't be talking to you.
He was right. Talking to someone like me who knew was like trying to pet a rattlesnake. It could all be over in a snap.
We gotta bring you in.
What are you gonna do?
Did we lose people?
Esteva's team, I said. Yep, something came through.
Jesus Christ. Are you saying you're causing manifestations?
I don't know.
But you do know. You, if anyone, knows. So tell me.
Looking back in the rearview mirror, I knew there was something riding along. Something that had caught on to me. Something that had stepped into our world, following the light of the red lilies. There was no point in denying it. I'll figure it out, I said. I'll deal with it. Before Thomas got the chance to object, I turned off my phone and chucked it out the window. I drove for the better part of an hour before a familiar sound snapped me to attention. Whatever surface-level plans I'd made in my head dissolved completely. I heard the sound before I saw the flashing lights. A siren. I was probably swerving left and right, trying to keep the car straight. No wonder I was being pulled over. This could get real bad, real fast. I thought about booking it and hoping for the best, but that'd just draw more attention to me. Instead, I found a secluded spot and pulled over. It was only as I pulled the handbrake that I remembered I'd been drinking earlier that night. I'd had about 2 rum and cokes. I'd completely forgotten about it. I tried to consider my options, but there was no time. I was told to turn off the engine, roll down the window, and place my hands on the dashboard. There were 2 officers, a man and a woman. I could barely hear them over my pounding heart. To them, it was a routine stop, but I was trying to save lives. They had no idea what kind of trouble they were in. I tried to wrap my head around it to come up with something plausible that they'd understand. I could tell them I had a bomb strapped to me or anything, but there was no time. I hadn't even heard them asking for my license and registration plate. I could feel a flashlight shine on my face, but I barely registered it. They asked me 3 times. Then, they changed tactics.
Sir, we need you to step out and place your hands on the hood of the vehicle.
I fumbled my response. There's something in the car, I said. You gotta be careful.
Sir, is there currently a weapon on your person? Something that can puncture or wound my partner? A pencil, a knife, a sharp set of keys?
No, listen, you gotta step back. There's something in... My thoughts blanked. There, by the side of the road, I saw one. A red lily, clear as day, growing through the cracks in the pavement.
Sir, I need you to cooperate with me.
The officer insisted.
Have you been drinking tonight?
I couldn't take my eyes off the red lily. It was like a reminder that this was already over. That my fate, and theirs, was sealed the moment we met. Dead men walking. Please, I whispered, let them go. For a second, I thought that might do it. I was willing to listen, to give in, if that's what it took for these people to live. The red lily knew. I know it knew. But like a lighthouse, it can't help but to shine, and to bring ships to shore. And with that, a familiar tremble rose in my stomach. H-E-L-L-O. There was a flicker as one of the light posts went out. I closed my eyes, trying to keep the tears in. The officer to my left started screaming. I heard a gunshot, but muffled, fired into something at close range. I heard fabric being torn, then flesh, then sinew and arteries. No one ever told me it was possible to discern the sound of marrow separating from breaking bone, but now I can't stop hearing it. H-E-L-L-O. Primal animalistic screams. A programmed response in our biology to alert other humans to stay away, to run. Splotches of blood rained down on the concrete and the hood of the car. I could feel something warm spatter across my face and run down my cheeks. The screams stopped. I'd sunk to my knees. I looked like a crying altar boy, praying for it all to stop. When I finally forced my eyes open, the world was red with blood. In the flicker of a dying light post, I saw something vaguely human drop the sundered remains of a torso. It followed my head movements, left to right, mimicking me. I could tell it was proud, like a dog bringing back a stick to its master. H-E-L-L-O. I stumbled to my feet. leaning against the car to steady myself. The concrete was slippery with blood. I kept stepping on something indiscernible. I tried to look straight ahead, as to not look at the entity too closely. It was just standing there, in the middle of the street, looking at me, waiting for me to say or do something. I looked straight ahead, pretending it wasn't even there. The car took a few turns of the key to start. The steering wheel was slippery with blood, but I managed to steer back on the road. The windshield wipers smeared the gore into a thin red veneer. I had to go away, far away, and there was only one place I could imagine. As I mentioned earlier, the DUC had certain containment areas. Previously, these were spaces where they simply moved people of interest, but with me there, they'd have to leave it alone. I'd be too dangerous to interact with. They'd have to trust that I wouldn't interfere as long as I kept to myself and out of the way. I burned my car in a field and walked 9 miles. I washed myself off in a river. This was a town designed to keep people comfortable enough not to ask questions. So, having a stranger wander in off the streets wouldn't be a problem. And everywhere I looked, there were red lilies. They were in the windows of every house, by the roadside, in every garden. Hell, they were even used as a logo. I'd seen that logo 100 times. Maybe they had no idea what it meant. I've stayed in that rural Minnesota town ever since. I've seen more horrors than I dared to count, but they seem to ignore me. They treat this place as a nesting ground or staging area. Considering how many of them there is, I'm astounded that anyone is still alive. DUC has declared this entire town a hazard. I've tried getting in touch with Thomas again, but all my attempts at communication with the outside world has been censored. If this by some miracle gets through the filters, I urge the DUC to get in contact with me. I want to be an asset. I want to help turning off the lighthouses. And as for everyone else, the best thing you can do is to stop asking questions. Don't question the armed men with strange helmets. Don't look too closely at the strange plant in the community garden. Don't look for anything abnormal, and if you see something, try to consider it might be artificial. Don't dig too deep into this. If you're not involved, consider yourself lucky, and stay out of rural Minnesota.
Hello and welcome to Daytime, your place for scary stories, straight from the horror forums of Reddit. Make sure to like and subscribe for more horror tales of things that go bumping the night. On tonight's episode, a woman gets a job for a ward when she starts to hear weird sounds coming from the nursery. So do you trust your babies with the hospital? Because there's a strange machine in the nursery.
My mother died when I was 12 years old. It was the single most traumatic experience of my life, and I'd be lying if I said I've gotten over it. But that isn't what has affected me most lately. Whenever a parent dies, most people just talk about the death itself. There's a lot of how and when, but not a lot of then what happened. It is that lasting legacy of what happens afterwards that really marks you for life. As my dad had to pick up extra hours to make ends meet, I had to help take care of my sisters. At that age, I barely made my own bed. Now I had to cook and bug my sisters about taking their showers. My younger sisters were far more depressed than I was. I didn't have time to be depressed. I had shit to do. So now, as an adult, I can kind of see that I got stuck in that rut. I'm still taking care of people. Maybe I'm afraid of what'll happen if I stop. Originally, I wanted to be a doctor, but we just couldn't afford that kind of education. I considered studying abroad, but my sisters still needed me long into their teenage years. Instead, I studied to become a nurse, which was the cheaper option. No less work, though. Just slightly cheaper. Once my sisters and I moved out, I got my own place, and I bounced around various hospitals and nursery homes around the state. I've worked at a rehab clinic, an open clinic, as an in-home nurse. All kinds of positions. I had 8 different jobs all in all, changing back and forth between them as one closed and another opened. But it wasn't until a few years ago that I saw an opportunity for a stable job. The biggest hospital in my home area had an opening for a nurse in the maternity ward. While I hadn't worked there before, I knew most of the procedures around the LDR rooms and the NICU unit. Sorry, I'll stop with the abbreviations. I got my first interview just days after the wanted ad went up. I was called in to talk with 2 of the nurses and one of the doctors. I could tell it was sort of rushed, and it all seemed like a bit of a formality. By the way they acted, I figured they could really use the help right away. Especially Dr. Gellin, who never even sat down. She was asking me questions while still pacing around the room. Surprise, surprise, I got the job. Starting Monday the following week, I got my first tour of the place. The first few weeks, I would mostly act as a helping hand while they figured out a more static position for me. In the meantime, I'd be moving from nurse to nurse, assisting them one by one. I didn't really have any responsibility of my own at first. The first few days I spent with Dr. Gellin, helping out in the LDR. I have pretty good bedside manners, and several expecting mothers were happy to have me distract them from whatever they were going through. I also had to run a few tests, sit in on ultrasounds, and help deliver some bad news. I don't want to go into details, but pregnancy isn't always this amazing and beautiful thing. After a few days, I helped out in the reception. Then, at the emergency room, and so on and so on. After about a month of working there, I had been pretty much everywhere but the nursery. You know, the fancy room with the glass windows where newborns rest up. I had seen it in passing once, but it was sort of off limits to newbies like me. There's a lot you must be aware of when working with someone that helpless. It was when I was assisting Nurse Rena that I finally took my first steps into the nursery. It was this large square room with several units lining the walls, well lit, with cheerful colors. It was empty when we went in there, having been cleared out for a proper spring cleaning, so it was a bit eerie.
We usually have half a dozen or so in here at a time.
Said Rena.
A few more around August and September.
I was a bit distracted. I kept hearing this strange noise.
You with me?
She asked.
What did I just say?
Sorry, I sighed. There's this noise.
There's gonna be plenty of noise.
She groaned.
You better get used to it.
No, it's like... It was hard to describe. It seemed to come from the center of the room. Some sort of machine noise. A broken vent? A thump. Some kind of machine, I continued.
Focus. What did I say?
It was there. Somewhere in the middle of the room, but what was it? Sorry, I smiled. One more time? As we left the room, the noise stayed in the back of my mind. It felt familiar somehow. But from where? The following days, things were getting busy. About half the patients we received had either some sort of condition or were oddly particular about their care. One woman had her partner sing-scream some kind of poem, for example. They had to be escorted out of the room. Another woman refused to have her baby without her favorite plant on the bedside table. Never seen a blue sunflower before. Never saw the kid either, for that matter. I was still assisting Rena in the nursery, and I got the opportunity to spend some time alone in that room. Even days later, the sound persisted. It was low, more like a hum, but it was definitely there. I thought it might be a heating issue, but I couldn't locate where it was coming from. I suspected the ceiling, but it had this strange echo to it that made it just as prominent near the floor. Strange. At one point, we had 5 kids in the nursery at the same time. Rena had the main responsibility, but she took me along every now and then just to quiz me and see how well I fared on my own. But now that there were little patients in there, she had no tolerance for mistakes or hesitation. One Friday night, as I was working the evening shift, I went into the nursery to roll out one of the children. Rena was already halfway down the hall, calling out to Dr. Gellin. So I had this short moment completely alone with all 5 kids. The lights were a bit dimmer, and at first I didn't notice anything. But after a few seconds, I could hear that sound again. But there was something else. As I looked around the room, I could see all the kids breathing in sync with the sound. Little chests heaving up and down. I gently pushed one of the units, accidentally waking up my little patient. As she stirred, she let out a soft cry, and for a moment, my mind blanked. I was just standing there in the middle of the room, and it felt like I was about to do something. and the machine noise was louder than ever. The kids were stirring. Maybe they could hear it too? It started to bother me. I asked a whole bunch of staff about it, but no one seemed to have any idea of what I was even talking about. If anything, the nursery was the quietest room in the entire ward. It had to be. You don't want to wake the patients. So when I started rambling about machine noises, they all just sort of tuned out. Even Dr. Gellin. Even after my time with Nurse Rena was up, I started coming back to the nursery every now and then. Sometimes, on my lunch break, I'd just stand there and listen, trying to find the source of the sound. That's actually how I got started here on Reddit. I started asking other medical professionals what that noise could be, and no one had a clear idea. I tried recording it, but it just wouldn't stick. Also, it is generally frowned upon to stand with a cell phone in the nursery, recording what could be a video. Big no-no. I went back over and over again, and it actually landed me in a bit of trouble. I had a private meeting with Dr. Gellin, who tried their best to understand my strange fascination with the nursery. Finally, I had to agree to leave my phone in my locker. I didn't go back there for a long time, but it was inevitable. The nursery is somewhat central to the entire ward, and you have to actively avoid it to never pass it. One night, as I was passing the glass window, I stopped to listen. But that time, I had a good reason. There were 4 kids in there, and they were the first thing I heard. Not the strange machine noise. The kids were crying, but they were crying in unison. Short bursts of screams. It was rhythmic in a way. I stopped to listen, and my mind immediately returned to the noise. I was sure that if I stepped inside, I'd hear the noise again. The kids. They were screaming in unison with the sound. I could feel it. And that was just the start. I could start feeling it even at home. I'd get frustrated whenever I heard my washing machine, as it was out of sync with the sound that haunted the back of my mind. Every rhythmic noise I heard just seemed off by comparison. It bothered me just how stuck that sound was, and I still had no idea what it was. And where had I heard it before? It came to a point where I sat up all night listening to a 4-hour recording of a construction site. Nothing. Nothing sounded like that goddamn machine. Ka-ka-ka-chung. At the end of a particularly long shift, as I was changing into my ordinary clothes, I stopped to listen to the hum of a fluorescent light in the bathroom. I could almost hear the rhythm of the electricity, and right there, behind my eyelids, was that rhythmic thumping again. I held my breath, and it felt like the sound was growing louder. I could feel my pulse go up. Why was I getting angry? Or was it fear? But it was real. The sound was real. The longer I closed my eyes, the clearer it was. With my eyes closed, I turned my head. The sound changed pitch. There, a direction where it was louder than ever. Loud enough to change the beat of my heart. It was coming from the nursery. God damn it. I slammed my locker shut and hurried out. I had to get to the bottom of this. The sound was so prominent that I could just close my eyes and it'd be there. It was beating in rhythm with my heart. I didn't care about anyone seeing me. I had to find out what it was. As I burst into the nursery, the newborns woke up. There were 7 of them in total. One by one, they started screaming. A steady, rhythmic scream. How had no one noticed this? How was I the only one? Ka-ka-ka-chung. Scream. Ka-ka-ka-chung. Scream. It wasn't a pained scream, more like a chant. This primal, instinctual grunt scream, almost melancholic. The sound grew louder, and my chest was pounding harder and harder. I thought I was having a heart attack. My fingers were aching, like someone was slowly turning my nerves counterclockwise. I didn't even realize it at first, but I was screaming too, to the rhythm of the grinding machine. I closed my eyes as hard as I could, trying to force the sound out of my head. Instead, it became clearer. And there, in the dark of my closed eyelids, I could finally see. It was a strange feeling, looking around the room with closed eyes. There were lines of beetles on the floor, reaching from the unit of every newborn to a spot in the middle of the room. It was clear as day. despite the darkness of my closed eyes. Black and gray beetles, marching to the rhythm of the machine, carrying little globs of white. And in the middle of the room was the source of the noise. From the side, it didn't look like much. It was sort of a pipe, with a faint yellow shine. It was about 3 feet wide, positioned in the center of the room. Line after line of beetles dove into it, the little globs of white falling out of their mouths. Despite my body screaming for me to get away, to get out, to take a breath, I had to look. With my eyes closed, I crawled forward. I looked down the pipe. It is strange not being able to close your eyes to make something go away. When you watch a scary movie, you can turn away. You can hide behind a pillow. But looking down that pipe, there was nothing I could do. I couldn't turn away, and my eyes were already closed. It is hard to describe. It was deep. Impossibly deep. Somewhere, miles below, there was a fire so bright that it burned my closed eyes. I could barely see it, shrouded behind hundreds of cogwheels, chains, live wires, and steam pipes. I just stared, watching the little beetles tumble over the edge, bumping against the absurd machinery. I could hear the little clicks and clacks of their shells as they struck the moving parts. Ka-ka-ka-chung. Something was moving. Something organic. Something living. There were hands reaching towards me. Hands getting burned on steaming pipes, getting mangled by cogwheels. But still, it kept coming upwards. I hadn't even realized that I'd stopped breathing. I'd held my breath for so long that I was getting lightheaded. I was being pulled away from the center of the room, away from the machine. Something pushed against my back, forcing air back into my lungs. There was a distant voice. 2 people were carrying me. My eyes opened, and I could see the nursery with my open eyes again. All 7 kids were lying on the floor, outside of their units. They were screaming at the top of their lungs, just like me. They heard it. I heard it. But somehow, I think they knew more about it than I did. I was carried away. They tried to get me to breathe again, but it was like my body forgot how to do it. It wasn't until I got a mask over my face, forcing air into my mouth, that I snapped back to reality. My heart was hammering away so fast and hard that my head hurt. I had no feeling in my hands, and both my feet had fallen asleep. My face was burning hot. Dr. Gellin was shining a light in my eyes, but it felt so far away. For a split second, I blinked. And there, in the darkness, I sensed something. It was a different shade of dark. It had followed me here. It was so impossibly tall, able to cross the room in just a few steps. As it reached for me, beetles tumbled onto my chest. Little globs of white getting ripped from my chest. Then, nothing. I must have passed out. They say it was some kind of psychotic episode. Hyperventilation, seizures. It didn't look good. I could no longer be around the children, so they were gonna have to either fire me or find somewhere else for me to go. It took me 2 days to recover, and I was so scared to close my eyes that they had to give me eye drops. My hands cramped from grasping the side of the bed, terrified of being picked up or pulled away in the middle of the night. At times, I could almost feel the little beetles crawling over me, picking globs of shining white out of me. Sometimes I felt the presence of something in the room. Even with closed eyes, I was scared to look. Some things can't be unseen. I was going to have a short interview with Dr. Gellin about the incident, but he was swamped that day. Instead, I got to talk to the chief physician, an older man who was a full head shorter than me. He asked me several questions about my medical history and my experience. It didn't really lead anywhere. That is, until we started rounding off the interview. As I read my social security number to him, to make sure he had my insurance info, he stopped.
Were you born in the area?
He asked. I guess, I said. You can tell?
The area number.
He nodded.
It is quite unique. There are 3 hospitals that cover that area, but 2 didn't have fully staffed maternity wards at the time you were born.
Handing my papers back to me, he gave me a long look.
You were born here, in this hospital, weren't you?
He asked. I had no idea, but it made sense. Mom had lived in this town all her life. I just nodded. He didn't respond. Instead, he just looked at me and sighed. Without a word, the meeting ended. The following week, I lost my job. While one could think it was because of my psychotic meltdown, I'm pretty sure it was because of that meeting with the chief physician. I think he knows something. If I had been born there, maybe I'd been in that room long, long ago, before I could even form memories. But if so, how could that noise sound so familiar? This was a few months ago, but I'm still looking for answers. That, and I think I'm going insane. I can still hear the click-clacking of little beetles falling to their deaths, and if I concentrate hard enough, I can hear the machine. It is not a memory. It is always there. I think there's a piece of me down there, inside it, still connected. Something listening, from the inside. Something that hurts. Little globs of white. I don't know what to make of this. I just want it out of my head. Some days I can distract myself enough not to hear it, but other days I can barely hear myself talk. It is always there, no matter what. It is like a rhythmic, haunting tinnitus. But I know there's more to it. Sometimes as I close my eyes, I can still see a faint glow in the distance. Sometimes not even in the direction of the hospital. Sometimes it is closer. Sometimes it has eyes. But the sound is the same. Always the same.
Hello and welcome to Daytime, your place for scary stories straight from the horror forums of Reddit. Make sure to like and subscribe for more horror tales of things that go bumping the night. On tonight's episode, a man searching for a home runs into trouble when he stumbles upon a haunted house. So, are you afraid to live in a big house alone? Because if not, you might see the many deaths of the six-door house.
I've been waiting to talk about this. I've been looking for others with similar experiences, or, I don't know, maybe I hoped I was insane. Months have passed, and I still don't have the slightest idea what to believe. But no matter what is true and what isn't, the memory of what happened to me is as true as can be. And every time I put my hand to a door, I tremble. I was looking for a house in the surrounding area. I know being a homeowner at 27 seems like a dream. I know I've been fortunate. Even so, I wanted something remote, spacious, and comparably cheap. I'd been looking for something nearby, but everything even close to a larger city quickly ran out of my price range. It wasn't until I started looking at the rural outskirts that I started to see something realistic. I'd been to 4 open house showings in the past week when I came across an ad that looked too good to be true. Another open house, but this one was just perfect. Apparently, they were looking to make a quick sale after a previous deal had fallen through. I made my way to a small nearby town called Tomskov. There was a little billboard with a blue sunflower greeting me, and I took a hard right down a street named Sun Plenty Road. There were only 5 houses there, and the one I came to look at was at the far end. Even from a distance, I could tell I wasn't the only visitor. I parked on the street outside and took in the sights. There was an open house sign outside, again with the sunflower logo. There was a separate garage, and the house itself was smaller than expected. Homely, but small. I was greeted by a cheerful man. He had thick glasses, a receding hairline, and the kind of fun uncle smile that told me he could get away with anything.
Come on in.
He said.
You're gonna love it.
There was me, the realtor, and 3 other people, a middle-aged couple, and a younger woman. She had this messy black hair that kept poking her in the eye. Even at a glance, I could tell the young woman was distraught. She wasn't even looking around the house. She seemed more interested in the people wandering about. The house had a simple and open layout. The bottom floor had a bathroom, a separate study room, an adjoining kitchen, and a lounge area. There were stairs leading to a sort of catwalk on the second floor, making the main room wide open. The second floor had another bathroom, a bedroom, and a guest room. It had this sort of sullen 70s vibe with gray and white flower-patterned wallpaper. There were little scuffs and tears pretty much everywhere, but the house itself seemed fine. The realtor, Anders, showed me all the details of the kitchen. He assured me that most of the appliances were to be replaced before the next homeowner moved in, and proudly displayed the new garbage disposal. It was a nice enough setup, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the young woman standing outside the study. I got the feeling that she was standing guard. As the middle-aged couple walked downstairs, they asked her, could they have a look?
No,
She answered with a shrug.
you can't.
Don't mind her.
Anders the realtor smiled.
Of course you can.
No,
She insisted.
they can't.
Anders walked up to her and leaned in. His demeanor shifted. They argued back and forth, and I could hear her repeat over and over.
This is not what we agreed to.
The middle-aged couple and I just looked at one another. While the realtor and the young woman argued, we introduced ourselves. I smiled and gave them my name. They were named Helen and Sebastian, or Seb for short. Typical Midwestern, salt-of-the-earth kind of people. They were suffering from an empty nest and seemed to want a place to start over. They made no secret about being interested in the place, although Helen wasn't sure about having no direct access to the garage. Seb, on the other hand, wasn't sure about the soil. He wanted a proper garden, and the soil seemed ill-fit to sustain greenery.
Still,
Helen smiled,
best place we've seen so far.
Sure is.
added Seb, giving Helen a little shake. Anders kept arguing with the young woman. I could overhear her name as Whitney, and she was not willing to cooperate. Finally, Anders just pushed past her, putting his keys in the lock.
Right this way. We'll just take a quick peek.
We're not done in there.
She said.
You can't just...
It was supposed to be packed up, Whitney. I can't help that you're late.
That's not... Please, give me an hour.
You've had plenty of hours.
He clicked the door open and pushed it in. The three of us gave Whitney an apologetic look as we stepped inside. The study was a mess. Old clothes strewn across various furniture, loose papers and books haphazardly thrown across a musky desk, an entire wall of bookshelves full of textbooks, ranging from discrete mathematics to philosophical physics. I stood there for a few seconds, taking it all in. Whitney pushed past us, grabbing an empty box from the floor.
Don't touch anything.
She sighed.
Just look at it and leave.
Anders leaned over to us, lowering his voice.
You have to excuse her.
He whispered.
There were some complications with the former owner.
Oh, she's the daughter?
Seb asked. Anders nodded. While Anders told us about the east-facing windows and the top-of-the-line air conditioning system, I couldn't help but to keep my eyes on Whitney. She was rummaging through the desk, dropping mementos, pictures, and notebooks into one of her many cardboard boxes. I could tell she was sleep-deprived. She kept yawning. Helen seemed eager to just leave Whitney to her grieving, while Seb kept to the practical details. He checked the hardwood floor, the insulation on the windows, the wall linings for pests. At one point, he almost knocked over a coffee table, and Whitney came running. She caught a vase that was about to topple off the table.
Don't touch anything.
She cried out.
Just, if you have to be here, stay still.
I'm, sorry.
Seb said.
I was just...
Just go over there.
She waved her hands around, shaking the vase. There was a little rattle coming from it. She shook it again, and I could see the color fade from her cheeks. Carefully, she tipped the vase, and something dark plopped into her hand. A large bronze key. Whitney pulled her hand back, letting the bronze key clatter to the floor. She covered her mouth, forgetting how to exhale. We just looked at her, having what seemed, to us, like a mental breakdown.
Nobody move.
She gasped.
Nobody do anything.
We all just stood there. Helen and Seb barely breathed, and I was suddenly hyper-aware of how still my feet were. Anders wasn't impressed. If anything, he was fed up with this. He rolled his eyes and picked up the key.
Whitney, I'm sorry. You're gonna have to wait outside.
Please put that down.
You can put it with your things and take it outside.
Just don't move. You don't know what you're...
Anders opened the door, stepped out of the study, and headed straight for the front door. Whitney dropped everything and ran after him. The rest of us followed suit.
Wait!
She called out.
Please wait!
As soon as Anders put his hand on the front door, Whitney stopped dead in her tracks.
Anders, please, I'm sorry.
She said.
Just step away. Give me the key. I'll leave, I promise. I swear.
That's enough of that.
No?
He opened the door and took a step forward. The bronze key passed the threshold. We'd all stepped into the main lounge by now, and I heard the door to the study slam shut. There was a sort of pressure shift, making the wind move through the main lounge. Every door in the house slid shut with a click, all except the front door, which was wide open. But there was nothing there. Not nothing as in no one standing there. No, nothing as in a nothing. Just a blank, black space. A viscous fluid where sunlight ought to be. Endless, abyssal ocean. I stared at it, mesmerized. The contrast of the bright sun coming in from the windows, bouncing off the ripples of this deep ocean doorway. And there, in the dark, humanoids. Tall, elongated silhouettes. Anders stepped back, but it was as if parts of him refused to move. His arms were locked in place, seemingly by an invisible force. And as he stepped back, something started pulling him in. His limbs grew long and twisted, his knees bending and snapping at impossible angles, his scalp pulled backwards, the loose skin of his face revealing the bottom white of his eyes.
Help.
It was all he managed to say as he was pulled into the dark. Limbs were quietly ripped from his sockets as his human frame was bent, twisted, torn, and mangled. Black water mixing with marrow as dark shapes turned Anders into what resembled an underwater cloud of flesh and claw. Whitney threw herself forward, slamming the door shut, leaving the bronze key on the floor. Screams erupted, and I didn't even notice they were mine. It was this primal force being pulled out of me, this need to scream. Like a baby desperate for her mother. Helen backed into a corner and sunk to the floor, with Seb trying his best to comfort her. Whitney just sat there looking at the bronze key, her face breaking out in cold sweats. I felt something turn in my stomach and headed for the bathroom. Whitney ran after me, but she couldn't make it in time. I burst through the bathroom door and collapsed on the floor, hyperventilating. Whitney stayed outside looking at me in shock.
You're fine.
She said it.
You're okay.
I wasn't. But compared to Anders, panicking on the bathroom floor seemed like a mercy. Whitney stayed with me as I calmed down. Seb and Helen joined us. After a few minutes of silence, Whitney excused herself. She came back with a pile of notebooks. She sat down across the hall from me, making sure not to enter the bathroom.
My dad, he found something.
She said.
I wasn't sure exactly what.
We should leave.
Said Helen.
We should leave right now.
We can climb out a window.
Said Seb.
If the door is...
Just, please,
Sighed Whitney.
just stay. We'll figure it out.
I mean no offense,
Said Helen up.
but what on earth was that?
Whitney turned the notebook to a specific page and read aloud.
I've been marooned in this house for 30 days. I never know where the door is. Sometimes I can hear water, sometimes not. I tried the windows, but it nearly burst my eardrums from the pressure as water came rushing in. I can't leave. I can't move. They wait behind the door. They wait for me to open.
Whitney scratched her head. Helen looked back and forth, as if waiting for something to make sense. Seb just shook his head.
What does that even mean?
Asked Helen.
What happened?
It has to do with the doors.
Whitney explained.
They wait behind the door.
There's nothing there.
Said Seb.
There's light coming through the windows.
It's not that easy. It's when you open it.
That doesn't make any sense.
Whitney stood up and handed Helen 3 notebooks.
We can argue the details of Dad's quantum entanglement experiment later, but that's not going to help us.
So, let's just go then.
Said Seb.
Let's leave.
You want to take your chances on the front door? That it won't come back? Go ahead.
Seb took a few tentative steps up to the front door. Helen wanted to protest, but she just started looking back and forth. Whitney crossed her arms and turned away.
I can't hear anything.
Said Seb.
Are you sure it's there?
It's somewhere.
Said Whitney.
I don't know the rules. It has to do with the doors.
I got up off the bathroom floor and looked at them. Seb took his hand off the front door and stepped back. Whitney turned her attention to...
You put yourself at risk.
Said Whitney.
That could have killed you.
The bathroom?
The door to the bathroom, any or all of these doors, it could be connected. Here, let me...
Whitney walked up to Helen and took one of the notebooks back. She turned to one of the latter pages.
The framework of passageway. Concept of thought. Paired in alignment, the darkness standing shy from the mirrored back of Empyrean. Realm unwilled and unbound, misshapen by collective subconscious. We cannot pass. Our world forgotten blocks dissipated. Like a bridge cannot be built of water, and a house cannot be built of wind. But the great craftsman blames not their tools, and eternal gold can be found in humble bronze.
Bronze, I said, like the key.
Look, my dad, we weren't on speaking terms. I've looked at all this for days, and all I can tell is that he was off his rocker. He died in that room.
Whitney pointed to the study. Helen hugged Seb tight, holding back a sob.
He couldn't leave. He was convinced that the door would eat him.
Helen sat down by the kitchen table. Thankfully, there was no door in between the kitchen and the main lounge. Seb walked straight up to Whitney, grabbed her by the collar of her blouse, and slammed her up against the wall, his calm demeanor cracking at the seams.
We shouldn't be here,
He said.
This is your fault.
I didn't know. It was all just ramblings. I didn't have time to clear it all out. How could I have known?
You recognize the key.
Said Helen.
You chased after him. You asked him to wait.
That's the only part that keeps coming back.
Whitney yelled.
Check the notebooks. The key, it's everywhere. It's everything.
So what do we do?
Seb asked.
Do we use it or destroy it?
Whitney looked at the pile of notebooks she'd managed to gather from the study. It was only a handful of everything we'd seen in there, but it might be enough to get some semblance of an answer. The house had 6 doors: the front door, the bathroom door, the study room door. On the top floor, there was another bathroom door, a door to the guest bedroom, and the main bedroom door. The bathroom door on the bottom floor was already open and considered safe. I could step in and out without a problem. Whitney explained as best as she could. Her father had grown increasingly paranoid since divorcing Whitney's mother. He'd locked himself in his house, committing fully to his studies. He'd always been a bit agoraphobic, and having a reason not to leave the house was a bit of a blessing in disguise. But over time, that blessing turned into a curse. An early entry read, "For years I've longed for the presence of mind to devote myself, and now that I can, I find myself wanting. I can't be certain. There is a door, a passage. It binds itself seemingly spontaneously. There is a risk involved, and it is a risk I cannot take." Seb tried to call for help, but water started pouring out of his phone. Whitney found a page about semi-passages, or shortcuts. Things that could be used as portals to another person or place. They weren't as conceptually clean as a door, and thus wouldn't invite them. But the connection would go through that dark place, the place that somehow her father had stumbled upon. I looked at the key for a long time. I didn't dare to touch it. It was unassuming in a way. It was old, had this sort of blocky texture, like it was made of little squares. While Helen and Seb rifled through notebooks, Whitney looked up and talked to me.
He just wanted a way to go wherever he wanted, without having to traverse the space in between. To just go from one door to another. All he needed was a key.
But why now? How are we trapped? I asked. We got in here just fine.
The realtor.
Sighed Whitney.
He tried to leave with the key. I think that triggered it.
So how do we untrigger it? Whitney shrugged and pointed to the notebooks. We had endless discussions. We compared notes, drew out theories. Helen thought we could force the bronze key out a window, but Whitney theorized that it'd just leave us locked inside. I suggested we listened at each door, just to eliminate which ones were safe and which weren't. We tried, but there was seemingly no way to tell. Sometimes I could hear rushing water on the other side, scratches on the wood. Other times, nothing. Even going back to the same door, it'd sound differently each time. We considered opening several doors at once. We spread ourselves out. I was at the upstairs bedroom door, right next to Seb, by the guest room door. Whitney was downstairs by the study door, and Helen insisted on the front door. We all put our hands on the handles. I wasn't sure if I could hear something on the other side or not. My heart was pounding too loudly. There were 6 doors. 5 were closed. 1 open. Someone was probably going to die.
There is only ever one door. He only speaks of it as a singular. It can change over time,
said Whitney.
This is our best shot.
We can't know for sure.
Said Seb.
And why do we even want to open them all? There's nothing in the bedrooms, right?
We're excluding, I said, like we did with the downstairs bathroom,
We should close it.
said Helen.
Shouldn't that improve our chances of our other doors being okay?
I have no idea.
Sighed Whitney.
Are we doing this?
Seb backed away from his door, taking the hand off the handle.
It ain't right.
He said.
None of it. It ain't right.
Everything erupted into an argument. Seb couldn't bring himself to risk his life for anything less than an exit, and Helen couldn't stop crying at the thought of that dark abyss. I couldn't blame her. To this day, I can't stop imagining it. Whitney, trying to act as a voice of reason, read aloud from one of the notebooks.
The concept of the passageway, the door, changes at the flick of a thought. An alien thought, like an invisible, uncontrollable shadow of the psyche. It refuses to be controlled. My exit could be my end, or as likely, a wooden frame. Much like we cannot control the smoke of a campfire, we cannot foresee the turning of the passageway.
We all looked at one another. Helen collapsed by the front door crying. Whitney was close to a mental breakdown. I felt this enormous burden settle in my stomach, like I was missing something,
Let's take the door off the hinges.
said Seb.
We'll turn it into an arch. Then it ain't a door anymore. You think that'll work?
In theory, maybe.
Said Whitney.
But how do we do that without opening it?
We'll take the whole frame off.
Seb said.
There's a crowbar under the sink. Saw it when I checked the garbage disposal.
Helen bent down next to the sink, put her hand on the kitchen cabinet handle. I gasped. Was that considered a door? Could it kill her? Would it? I imagined that dark, cold abyss. That enormous force pulling me in, turning my very form into this unrecognizable mass. Where no screams can be heard. All I'd have to show for such unimaginable anguish would be a burst of bubbles. Then nothing. No! I cried out. Stop! But it was too late. Nothing happened. Helen opened it, pulled out the crowbar, and that was that. But for a brief moment, I realized how Whitney's father must have felt. That uncertainty, not knowing for sure if that one flick of the wrist would be damnation or nothing. Helen handed the crowbar to Seb, while Whitney gave me a pat on the shoulder. I couldn't stop crying. My whole body was shaking from the sudden rush of adrenaline. Meanwhile, Seb walked up to the front door and started tapping the wood. The theory was this: if there was no door, nothing could come through. There was no point in doing a test run, because if it didn't work, someone would lose their life either way. It was better to have an honest chance of getting out. Whitney gathered towels. She had this idea that maybe water might start leaking if the door was turned into a semi-passage, like a window. If so, we might have to find a way to quickly stop the flow. By the time we got the towels, Seb started working on the door frame. As that first crack rang out, I heard a click. The front door slid open. Without a moment's thought, Seb pushed it close. It had barely opened an inch. We all held our breaths. We were fine. Nothing was happening.
It's clear.
Helen called out.
There's nothing there. I saw it. It was nothing.
It can change.
Whitney yelled back.
We can't take that risk again.
Like hell we can't.
Seb put his hand on the front door, but Whitney tackled him. The crowbar fell to the floor as Helen rushed forward to help.
Listen.
Whitney yelled.
Just listen.
A rumble, like a great whale passing in the distance. It was right there, on the other side of the front door. Without a word, they all stood up and backed away. The door shook from the passing force. Something was definitely there,
Then the rest should be fine.
said Seb.
We can get to the study.
Whitney nodded, and the two of them burst into a sprint. Helen wasn't convinced, but didn't know what to say. Whitney dropped her crowbar, and as she bent to pick it up, Seb opened the door to the study. Darkness.
No.
Panic exploded. Helen grabbed his arms, trying to pull him out. Whitney crawled backwards, closing her eyes and covering her ears. I couldn't watch. All I heard was Helen screaming his name over and over. There was a gargle, a scream turning into an inhuman screech like a burning pig.
Sebastian!
Helen kept repeating.
Sebastian! Sebastian!
There was a click, and then nothing but crying. I looked up to see Helen collapsed against the study door. It had slid shut from the pressure on the other side.
I'm coming, Sebi.
She cried.
I'm...
She opened the door again, and there was the study just as we'd left it. Helen collapsed on the floor, curling up into a fetal position. She kept making this childlike yowling, scratching the surface of the hardwood floor, as if trying to dig Seb back into reality. But there was nothing left, not even water droplets on the floor. Then there were her arms. She'd held on until the door had slammed shut. Her sleeves were torn and her arms bloody. Not much, but there were these round little suction marks. They were already bruising with spots of blood poking through the skin. I sat by Helen as Whitney started rifling through the study. There were more notebooks, more theories, more diaries, notes about experiments, clever tricks, and attempts. So far, every idea to understand the rules were in vain. We couldn't make sure. No matter what, we could never be truly sure. 2 open doors, 4 closed. I don't know how many hours passed. I managed to get Helen to the couch, but she was inconsolable. She could barely comprehend words anymore. She didn't blink, and she could barely breathe. There were no coherent thoughts in her mind, just darkness. This awful, soul-sinking darkness. Whitney propped up the open doors with books and towels to make sure they wouldn't accidentally close. All the while, she kept trying to convince herself.
We keep opening them one by one,
She said.
If we can get it to manifest in one single place and keep that door open, we should be able to leave by another.
The sun had started to set outside. For all intents and purposes, this still just looked like a house. The windows were clear, showing the greenery outside. Maybe it was all a lie. Maybe none of it was really happening. But looking down at Helen and her unblinking eyes, I knew it was the realest thing I'd ever experienced. There's 3 of us, I said. 4 doors. We can't make it.
No, that's perfect.
Nodded Whitney.
We open all but the front door. It manifests. Then we can get out through the one safe remaining door.
Unless we all die, there's nothing that says it can only be in one place,
It is implied.
said Whitney.
If you got a better plan, just tell me. But unless you want to starve to death, we gotta...
Starve? I interrupted. Is that what... I looked back at the study where Whitney said her father had died. No words were necessary. She took a deep breath and nodded.
He couldn't bring himself to try.
She said.
So we have to ask ourselves what we want. A long but certain death or a violent risk at life?
The fridge, the freezer, and all the cupboards had been cleared out. Whitney found some raisins for us to share while we pondered what to do. Helen couldn't eat. She stared blankly ahead, waiting for her mind to come wandering back. It was dark outside. Whitney rolled the bronze key between her fingers.
I wonder how he did it.
She sighed.
He never made any sense to me.
Maybe it doesn't make sense, I shrugged. At least not to us.
Then what made him so special?
Well, he did have a lot of books, I said, reaching into a pile we'd gathered from the study. Just look at some of these. Astrology of Abraham, Channels of Esoteric Geometry. I like this one, I said, holding up a little red book. Diary of Emmett Rask.
Right. But it doesn't beat the...
Whitney pulled out another book from the pile, turning it over.
The 13 Faiths of the Blameless Mother.
I shook my head, looking over at Helen. I handful of raisins slipped between her fingers. She didn't even bother closing her hand. Looking back at Whitney, I sighed. "You're right," I said. "We have to try." So we did. We lined ourselves up on the top floor. Helen on the far right near the bathroom. I was on the far left, by the guest room. Whitney was in the middle, by the bedroom. Helen didn't understand. She just mimicked us.
We're gonna open on 3.
Said Whitney.
And no matter what we see, just run. Run downstairs and just go. Get out.
I nodded. Helen didn't. 1. I tightened my grip. I saw Helen follow my lead, giving me an exhausted look. She could barely keep her eyes open. 2. I started doubting which way to turn the doorknob. I'd turned a million doorknobs throughout my life, but that was the first time I'd really thought about which way to turn it. I imagined myself hearing water, bubbles, distant rumbles. I tried telling myself that it was all imagined, fake, tricks of the mind. But in my heart of hearts, I knew it wasn't. 3, we opened our doors. All I saw was a well-made bed, a bag of toiletries, probably Whitney's. I left the door open and turned around. Helen was smiling as the darkness welcomed her.
Come on.
Whitney screamed.
Leave her.
The door to the bedroom was open, clear, but I was standing just 10 feet away from an endless abyss. Helen looked at it as if searching for something. She touched the surface with an outstretched hand.
Seb, honey.
She cried.
Sebby, please.
A pulse shot through her. I could see the hair on her arm stand up, her veins turning black.
Oh, Sebby.
In an instant, her flesh unraveled as it flayed itself from the inside out. Her scream stifled as something pulled her in, leaving splotches of blood behind from the outline of her feet. A pained moan escaped her, only to be turned to harmless bubbles and pressurized void. Whitney grabbed me by the neck and pulled me downstairs. We ran to the front door. We looked back a final time just to make sure it was still manifested upstairs. It was still there. We'd sacrificed Helen, but we'd make it out. Whitney pulled the front door open and stopped. Darkness. We'd been wrong. Whitney turned to run as an impossibly long arm grabbed the flesh of her back, straight through her clothes. It pulled her back. I crawled away, not being able to close my eyes.
Help me.
She cried out.
For God's sake, fucking help me.
I shook my head, not knowing what to do. I'll never forget those desperate eyes. The betrayal, the pleading. She fought every inch of the way. She dug her nails into the hardwood floor. She kicked, she pulled, she screamed. But for every second she stayed, the more painful it was. With a final snap, fingers dug into her spine, folding her like a lawn chair. A lifeless body dragged across the floor, unceremoniously pulled into the dark with a quiet squelch. And the door, slightly damaged by Seb and his crowbar, slid shut. I was all alone. The door to the guest bedroom and the main bedroom remained open. There was the bathroom and study downstairs. Just 2 closed doors left. The bathroom and the front door. Both closed, both wrong. There was no right answer. I must have stayed there for days. I found some trail mix in Whitney's bag. I had water. I could shower. I had a change of clothes. I scoured the notebooks over and over and over, trying to find the slightest hint on what to do. There had to be some way of knowing for sure. There had to be. It wasn't until I came across a final note that I realized it was over. It read, "By will alone, we cannot make ourselves right. Right is right, independently of our actions and intentions. We cannot control that which never was, and we cannot be part of that which will never be. There could be no more perils for me to face, and yet I cannot bring myself to leave. There's no certainty in the unknown, and I choose not to live by chance alone." I cried myself to sleep at night. I banged on the walls. I even tried opening a window only to have my left eardrum blown out from the pressure drop. Got a nasty nosebleed as well. I tried reading. I tried making up little worlds in my head. I imagined myself safe and sound, but it was useless. In those final hours of desperate loneliness, I knew I couldn't fool myself any longer. I was going to die. I found myself with my hand on the front door. I learned every crease of the wood, the temperature of the metal handle. I listened to it, studied it. At times, it was quiet. At other times, it wasn't. Sometimes I imagined it quiet. Other times, I imagined voices coming from the other side. Maybe I wasn't imagining it. Finally, I grasped the bronze key. Starving, exhausted, and mentally broken, I opened the front door. Sunshine. And there on the fresh-cut lawn was another realtor, just as confused as I was. So, turns out I was only in there for about 16 hours total. And to this day, no one seems to remember neither Anders, Seb, Helen, or Whitney. According to every document I can find, the owner of the house had no children. The cars parked outside were unregistered. On paper, it seemed like the entire world had forgotten that these people were ever part of this plane of existence. I don't think anyone's lying here. There was a sincere disbelief and confusion to every piece of my story. To onlookers, I seemed like a squatter that had gone insane. I've tried to find anything about this. They won't let me go back to read the notes. The investment firm who owns the real estate company swept it all under a rug and tore the place down. I suspect they were the ones who made the bronze key mysteriously disappear from the evidence room. I've tried to find copies of the books I found in there. Some of them have been seen in passing on strange message boards, and one just keeps making my computer turn off whenever I try to Google it. Who the hell is Emmett Rask anyway? If anyone knew these people or have heard about this phenomenon, please, I need to know I'm sane. I need to know this isn't all a dream. I need to know I won't wake up with my hand on that front door, having imagined living a life back outside. This has to be real. I am real. There is nothing on the other side of the door. Go ahead, listen. There's nothing there. It can't be. Can it?
Hello and welcome to Daytime, your place for scary stories, straight from the horror forums of Reddit. Make sure to like and subscribe for more horror tales of things that go bumping the night. On tonight's episode, a man working for a law firm decides to go above and beyond for a promotion when he starts to go insane. So, are you aware that no one has ever lived in this house?
Back in 2017, I was about 6 months out of an internship with a local law firm. I was a junior legal assistant as part of a retainer team for a statewide biodiesel business. It wasn't my only assignment, but it was the one I was formally hired for. However, during downtime, I was bounced around various teams all throughout the year. It was early February when the call came. The biodiesel place had a new owner, and he wanted to shake things up. Our jobs were safe, but he wanted to make some investments. New manufacturing plants, 2 in Missouri and 1 to the west, within reasonable driving range from their warehouses. Only problem was there were no suitable properties to build on. This could be a multi-million-dollar kind of thing, but we didn't have a property to sign off on. That is, until I realized the area they were looking at, my old hometown of Tomskog, Minnesota. I suggested looking into an old property I'd gone by 1,000 times on my way to school. It was this massive empty field on the outskirts of the town with nothing but a few rundown houses that could be easily torn down. We knew the place was privately owned, but had no idea of who the proprietor was. My boss was ecstatic. See, the client had been considering calling the whole thing off, but if we could offer them a property, we could probably get a fat bonus check, along with a finder's fee. It would be enough to take the junior part off my job title. Since I suggested it, I was given time off to get in touch with the owner of the property. There were some initial problems. The original property documents had been damaged in a flood back in 2014, and only part of the archive had been digitized. The document I was looking for might not have been digitized yet, and since no immediate documents were available, I was starting to suspect the worst. The clerk at the municipal office promised they'd get back to me with the name within 4 to 8 weeks, 12 at the most. That wasn't an option. So I packed my bags, handed my cat to my mom, got the fancy maroon BMW company car, and set my sights on familiar roads. It took me 2 stops for gas and a needlessly complicated detour because of a fallen oak tree. But I made my way to that field just as the sun started to set. After all these years, it was exactly as I remembered. One large empty property now covered in mud-stained February snow. A rundown barn at the edge of the property, and a small one-story log cabin right next door. All roads were overgrown, and there were no discernible paths out there. I considered going back in the morning, but I figured I had some time left. Maybe there was this big plaque with the name of the owner out front. If so, I could have it all settled in a day and be on my way home before I even had the time to unpack. It was getting late, and the shadows were growing longer, but I was willing to roll those dice. I double-checked my phone, got a flashlight from the trunk, and locked my car. The snow was deep enough to reach my knees. My fancy shoes felt like paper. The cold went straight through. Still, I pushed on, beelining straight across the field. I severely overestimated how much time I had left. By the time I got to the cabin, it was already getting dark. Using the flashlight, I took a quick lap around the place, just to make sure I wasn't walking into some kind of hillbilly trap room. It didn't take long for me to realize that this place had been abandoned for years. Not only was it boarded up, but the boards used were rotten. That the place was standing at all was nothing short of a miracle. I tried knocking a little just to make sure no one was home, but I wasn't holding my breath. The place was desolate. I looked for some kind of name or plaque or hell, something carved into a wall somewhere, anything. But there really was nothing. I considered coming back in the morning, but I could see dark clouds on the horizon, and I didn't want to walk through that snow more times than necessary. I decided I'd do a little urban exploring. After all, if the door was open, it wouldn't hurt to have a peek inside. Walking up to the door, I noticed something strange. There was a carving at the top of the doorframe. Word by word, my flashlight revealed the full sentence. No one has ever lived in this house. I tried to wrap my brain around it. It didn't make much sense. What the hell did that even mean? Of course, someone had lived there. Someone built it, and someone owned the property. Why would there be a house in the middle of nowhere that no one had ever lived in? I hesitated. Something told me to just walk away and come back in the morning. The clouds on the horizon and my freezing feet were telling me otherwise. There was a carving. That meant someone had the habit of leaving messages. Chances were there might be more of them inside. Twiddling the handle a little, I noticed the door was unlocked. So in I went. The cabin had a very basic layout. There was one large room with a wooden bench facing a simple fireplace. There were 2 handmade tables, and the westernmost wall was lined with dried herbs, mostly blue and black. There was a surprisingly clean cow skin on the floor, as well as a small door on the easternmost side of the room, leading to a kitchen. It was mostly just an antique kind of stove, and a couple of cabinets. But whoever had lived there must have been accustomed to a sparse lifestyle. But no, that wasn't it. I had to correct myself. The carving said no one had ever lived there. Then, why the furniture? I decided to ignore the message for the time being, instead focusing on finding the name of whoever owned the place. There might be some initials on the handmade furniture. I gently moved the bench and tables first, going over them with my flashlight. There were no obvious markings, but another problem quickly arose. My flashlight was giving up on me. It started to flicker. Looking around, I could see no other possible source of light but the old fireplace, and I couldn't imagine that thing not being clogged. Then again, there was firewood, and I did have a lighter. I quit smoking about 2 years prior, but I always kept it around, just in case. Breaking off a piece of bark and lighting it, I double-checked to make sure the smoke cleared and went up. Surprisingly, it did. Glancing at my phone, I figured I could use it for a flashlight as well, but I didn't want to drain the battery. Instead, I lit a fire and left the front door open just in case the smoke didn't entirely clear out. Carbon monoxide poisoning ain't no joke. As the fire sputtered to life, I sat down to take a breather on the bench. It was a pretty cozy little cabin, the kind of place you'd stay in a night or two when going fishing. I could imagine my dad warming his hands by that fire. I lost him in 2010. That was the kind of place he'd always been most at home in. As I warmed my hands, watching my shadows grow longer, I could imagine him sitting next to me. I could almost hear him, and in that moment, my eyes drifted to a space right in front of the fireplace. A space where a small iron plate protected the floor. I don't know what drove me to look closer, but I realized there were no screws or nails keeping the plate down. So, with a quick touch of the fire poker, it came loose, revealing a sort of makeshift metal box. There were 4 items in total inside. A broken pocket watch, an empty hip flask, 3 spent shotgun shells, and a small journal. I went straight for the journal, checking for a name. It was getting darker outside, so I huddled around the fire. As snow began to tap against the wooden barricades, I had 2 choices: to steal this journal, or to read it by the fire as the storm raged on. It was my cold feet that decided for me. I took off my shoes and warmed them by the fire as I started to slowly read my way through the rough cursive text of the old journal. Not the kind of job I'd imagined I'd do at a law firm, but things never quite go the way you've planned. I opened the first page, hoping to find a name. Instead, I was greeted by a strange text. Journal written by. Then nothing. That was it. No name, just that. I turned the book over, back and forth. No name anywhere. I kept reading. The first page reads as follows. I once had name and creed, a couple of truths, thrown to the grave long before my end. Now I remain battered and empty. My history is unusual as my mind turns sun-bleached and distant. My heart burns of wrath, but I cannot recall as to why. I turned the page. I couldn't help but to be intrigued, if not for any other reason than to find the name of the author. This house is not my property, and to my recollection, no one has ever lived here. He proceeded to discuss at length the part of his history that he did remember. Growing up in Wisconsin, being the son of a shoemaker, little anecdotes of a long life. His first kiss, his first love, his first house. But the further along he tried to remember, the foggier it got. I was starting to think I might never find a name, but I wasn't sure why. At some point, the author recalled something happening. He couldn't explain what or why or where, but he could recall something upsetting his routine. Something came to him and it made him upset. He spoke about putting up barricades, keeping a loaded shotgun at the ready, and locking himself inside for days on end. It might have been here that I made my stand, he wrote. It could be. It should be. But I can't say that it was. He would go on to detail some sort of struggle, but he couldn't picture what it was against. The text was so strangely written. I could tell there were segments, as if written piece by piece, but it was impossible to tell just how much time had passed between them. Even in the journal, the author lamented on large segments of time randomly missing. I couldn't help but to consider the other items in the box, in particular the spent shotgun shells. The author proceeded to explain how he'd broken the pocket watch, as it had frustrated him. He was losing track of time. He might think 10 minutes had passed, only to realize the entire afternoon was gone. He broke his watch as a reminder that he couldn't trust himself anymore. Maybe I'll remember that, he wrote. Or will the watch unbreak itself? I was disrupted from my read by a sudden noise. Looking up, I could see the fire was dying out, but the sound actually came from my phone. Turns out, it was my automated time to go to bed alert. I'd been sitting there for 6 hours. That didn't make sense. I stood up, clutching the journal. There was nothing there. The cabin was empty, but I couldn't escape the sudden sense of dread. Like something awful had just happened, but I couldn't say exactly what. Looking down on the journal, I suddenly realized that I felt exactly as described by the author. I felt this unexplainable anxiousness, like that uneasy feeling you get when you feel that someone is watching you, only more palpable. Standing up with my back to the fireplace, I continued reading. He continued to explain how his flask was empty, but that he couldn't remember drinking from it. He detailed his plans to conceal a few items along with his journal for an entire day, just to see if he could remember to retrieve it. But not yet, he lamented. There are trespasses to deal with. This was where the spent shells came into play. The author revealed how he'd found a group of strange trespassers. He'd taken them all out with his shotgun. He wrote in detail about shooting 3 times, but that he couldn't remember anything about them. Men, women, or children. There was no way to tell. I buried them by the barn, he detailed. It seemed like the right thing to do. Why am I crying? As the journal neared its end, the author tried to summarize his remaining thoughts. Something came to him. Wherever he was, it did something, and as a result, everything was destroyed. He was devastated, but couldn't even remember why. It was like muscle memory. Something in his body was remembering the sadness. I inscribe upon this door, he wrote, that no one has ever lived here. I do not recall this place or anyone living here. It serves as a warning and a reminder that this is not my home. And with the final page, the author documented putting it all in a sort of hidden lockbox in front of the fire. He would do so for one day to see if he could remember retrieving it. Evidently, he couldn't. With the final words on the final page, he gave one last piece of insight, perhaps in a moment of clarity. It started when I lit the fire, he wrote. Everything turned worse after I lit the fire. Looking back at the fireplace and the sputtering logs, I slowly came to the realization of what kind of situation I'd put myself in. I had accidentally followed the footsteps of a man who used to be in that cabin. A man that might have owned it, but couldn't even remember it. Or who knows, maybe he was just passing by. I decided to take my chances and just leave. I brought the journal along, opened the door, and prepared to brave the weather. But something happened. Right then and there. Something made me stop. And I just stood there. I stood there long enough for my hands to turn blue, and I only snapped out of it when a snowflake hit my eye. I wasn't alone. There was something there, and it was doing something to me. I had rung the damn dinner bell. Thinking about it, it feels a bit like being eaten alive. Not physically, but the same feeling remains. This heedless consumption. Something taking an intimate part of what makes you into you and tearing it away. That's what I still remember. That's what it feels like. But it is hard to explain something I can't remember. It feels like a void in your mind, but you have this instinct to fill it with something bad. Like watching a scary movie and knowing something horrifying is about to pop up. Every time I think about it, trying to picture it in my mind, I get that same feeling. Sometimes my mind fills it as a sort of organic darkness, roughly shaped as a person. Other times it's just some guy. It changes whenever I look back at it because there's nothing there for me to remember, so my mind fills in the blanks. But who's to say that all those blanks are false? I turned around and realized I'd been exposed to this thing. It was doing something to me, and it was bad enough to make me run headfirst into the dark. Looking back at this, all I really remember feeling was that immense panic. A prey reflex, like trying to escape a wild animal. I ended up in the old barn, where I hid behind a mound of debris next to one of the collapsed walls. My fingers were freezing, but I was going to call for help no matter what. Only problem was, I couldn't remember the code to unlock the phone. I tried, but between my fingers being too cold to register, something unfathomable approaching from just around the corner, I decided it was better to hunker down and be quiet. Because while I can't remember anything about the physical features of it, I remember thinking it wasn't very perceptive for some reason. It passed me by, but I couldn't make any sounds without revealing my position. Calling for help was out of the question. Instead, I turned my attention back to the journal. My lock screen had a bright picture blurred in the background, allowing me to use it as a makeshift mini flashlight of sorts. For some reason, I wasn't afraid that the creature would spot me visually. Perhaps it didn't have eyes? I turned the pages back and forth, looking for a particular segment. There was something about the weapon the author had used to deal with the intruders that left me wondering, but I could barely make out anything in that journal. Between my pounding heart, my freezing hands, and the strange thing lurking about, I couldn't make heads or tails of the damned cursive text. I can't remember what kind of sounds the creature made, but I can remember the sounds the environment made when it passed. I remember wood splintering as something climbed the walls. I remember creaking wood from a sudden weight coming down. I remember a door splintering as it was torn from its hinges. Finally, I found the page I was looking for. Just after talking about how he didn't know why he was sad about killing the intruders, the author wrote, "I threw the damn thing into the hayloft. I have not been able to retrieve it, as the memory of its shape eludes me." How does one recognize a weapon that one has no recollection of ever wielding? I waited for the entity to step outside before I made my way upstairs. It is a strange feeling, trying to balance the instinct to run with the obsessive thought of staying quiet. Every creaking floorboard sent shivers down my spine, curling my toes in anticipation of something running me down. But nothing happened. It didn't take long for me to find it. An old double-barreled hunting rifle. Looking over it, I saw that there was some sort of shell still loaded. Perhaps it had worked, perhaps not. I was no expert, and I didn't have much of a choice but to try. I'd be a sitting duck out there without it. After all, I couldn't remember where I'd parked my car. I decided to go on the offensive. I made my way down the stairs a little too quick, and before long I heard this scurrying noise as something entered the old barn. I remember standing a good 15 feet away from it and raising the weapon towards it. It stopped, but so did I. For a while, we just sort of circled one another. I remember my movement being in response to a threat. Is this eat or play? I asked. If this is you eating, I bet all those memories disappear after a while. Digest it. Then you wouldn't remember what this is, or what it does. But you do, don't you? I remember tapping the rifle for emphasis. There was a long pause, but I can't remember why. Did it respond? Could it talk? If you're just playing, then you might remember that this thing is loaded, I continued. And you might know what it does. You saw what happened when he used it. You heard it. A shorter pause. We stopped circling. I gripped the weapon tighter and stepped forward, advancing. If this was a consumer, and it worked in any way like we do, it would absorb and convert what it fed on into some sort of nutrient. But if it was just collecting for some reason, then it would have this archive of thoughts to recollect from. That was my reason. Or maybe it was just clever. Maybe it was just as clever as I was. I made my way back outside. Even in the newly fallen snow, I managed to find what remained of the path I'd made when I first got there. I walked backwards down the path, my rifle steadily aimed at something. I didn't want to pull the trigger. If it misfired or I missed, I was dead. Just having the means of defending myself was enough to keep it away, for now. I think it had left some sort of toxin in me. Despite not being anywhere near me, I still felt the effects of it. I kept falling into this sort of fugue state, getting turned around and losing grip of where I was going and why. At one point, I was just standing there, gawking at the dark, as my rifle thumped to the ground. But there, in the dark, a memory surfaced. The same memory I'd felt back at that cabin. Thoughts of my dad taking me fishing. Back then, we'd worn rubber boots, and instead of snow, there was mud. It was still deep, and I had to walk the same way that I did in the snow. Maybe that's what triggered the memory to begin with. I tried to keep that image in my head. The anticipation as we gathered our bait. Learning how to tie a proper knot. Getting the correct measurements for the distance between the hook, the weight, and the bobber. I could almost hear the spinning fishing line as the red and white bobber sailed across the lake. Just holding on to something I knew I couldn't forget was all I needed. It became this sort of bedrock, keeping me from completely losing my mind and focus. I could keep going, holding on to something I knew to be true. It was a backstop, keeping me from losing track. I grabbed the rifle and pressed on. As I did, I remember something rustling the nearby trees, retreating into the woods. By the time I made it back to my car, the toxin had completely taken hold of me. At that point, I had little to nothing to hold on to, but for a few cherished memories. I crawled into my car, locked all the doors, and tucked myself into a fetal position in the back seat, still clutching the rifle. My body didn't know how to react. I was hot, cold, wide awake, and deeply unconscious, all seemingly at random. I would lose my sense of object permanence, bobbing my head back and forth, completely forgetting what I was doing and what was even happening. At one point, something made the passenger door creak. Maybe someone tried to open it. Luckily, all doors were locked and I had the keys. I remember laying in the back of the car, raising the rifle. Then there was a pause, a long one. Something made me shake my head. It made me angry and afraid, very afraid. It left me with this sense of a rabbit being stared down by a pack of wolves. I had something it wanted, something it deeply valued. Again, this creature is just this nothingness. I can't recall what it looked like or if it was even a physical being. From context, I think it could talk. I think it said something to me that I didn't want to hear. To this day, when I think of it, my mind just conjures these otherworldly horrors. Teeth, skin, claws. But I didn't lower my rifle. Not for a second. I didn't try my luck, and I didn't challenge fate. And by the time the sun rose, it was gone. And with it went the sweats, the confusion, and much of the memory voids. First thing I did was check the shotgun shell. Turns out, it was already spent, empty. That leaves a lot of questions, uncomfortable ones. If that thing was just collecting, it would have known that I couldn't hurt it. If it knew that, why did it let me go? Did I trade it something? How would I even know? But if it was just feeding, then how did it know to stay away from the rifle? I have managed to put the story together piece by piece. Some of my memories are still a bit touch and go, but this is the most complete retelling I can make. I've tried to fill in as many blanks as I can, but it's hard. I kept a journal. I think I still have it somewhere. I showed it to my boss, but it was a weak comfort. The client eventually ended up choosing another site, leaving us in an awful position. Needless to say, that trip didn't get me promoted. That happened years later. Yeah, I still work there. Same firm. I get the feeling that this thing didn't just make people forget things. It made people be forgotten too. Despite all my efforts, not a single person I've met or talked to can remember anyone ever hearing anything about the people who used to live here. Even the cleric at the municipal office kept forgetting I'd even made the request to inquire about the land to begin with. That might have just been laziness, though. But I get this feeling that I'm missing something. Even though I've wrapped my head around most of this, and most of what happened out there, I often get the feeling that I lost something. In those moments, when everything in the world feels uncertain, half true, I look back at that day with my dad. I listen to the spinning of the fishing line. But here's the thing, Reddit. This is what bothers me. This is what made me want to post, to kind of save this for posterity. Like a journal of my own, hidden by my own fireplace. Lately, I can't remember what my dad's eyes looked like. Am I just forgetting, or is something forgetting it for me?